look out at people just in the audience, I just think, man, I wish I could meet every single one of you, because every person I meet seems like they're just doing really amazing stuff. So thank you for being here. Thank you for attending the conference. Thank you for making it great. Like Mark said, I play a professor in my job, so I got to wear the jacket today, which I don't normally do. So I'm going to get to spend a little bit of time on theology for a minute. But just before I do that, I want to show you a couple of things that I just get to work on in my spare time. I still get to do some programming, and so I just want to show you a couple projects. So one of those things is something I made a while back. So I bought the domain name worship.ai kind of in the mid-era of the early Gen AI stuff. And so this was just an early kind of in-browser recurrent neural network that let you generate worship songs. It's not as good as what's out there now, but this has been something I've been playing around and thinking about for a long time. And then when I was in seminary, I would often ask professors for lists of commentaries, and I thought I could combine this together like a Rotten Tomatoes for commentaries. So I made bestcommentaries.com. It aggregates reviews and rankings. What I didn't realize is that the data was really biased in a particular direction, and so I had to think a lot about how ethical my algorithm was and how I was influencing pastors. And so I've been working on that for a while. And then one of the things, some of the YouVersion guys are here today, and I made something a little bit different. It's called Y'all Version. And what JP noted earlier, that people used to all sound like he sounds, but sadly we lost the distinction between you singular and you plural. Well, here in Texas, we restored that. And so, Jeremiah 29:11, it's one of those wonderful verses, but it really says something spectacular. It says not just I have plans for you and you individually. It says God has plans for y'all. God has plans for the entire universe. And so I hope that can be an encouragement thing. You can check out y'allversion.com or go look in the Bible app. So what I want to do today is I want to start with where I started with when I started doing technology and faith stuff. So this was my opening belief that I just kind of assumed technology is just neutral. All that matters is how you use it, right? And I wanted to use it for good, like everybody in this room. I didn't want to use it for bad. So we know the bad stuff that's out there. Let's not do that. Let's do the good stuff. Somewhere along the way, I realized that this view is not only wrong, it can be dangerous. To believe that technology is neutral can actually damage what you do. And so what I hope I can convince you of is something like this. To say this, that theologically speaking, that technology is just good, full stop. When God says he creates things and he says it's good, that's part of that goodness of creation. But then secondly, that it's never neutral. And if I was to expand on that a little bit, what I mean is that technology is part of what it means to be an image bearer. Our use of tools, this is part of what God made us to do. At the same time, whenever we use tools, they always form us in interesting and sometimes unexpected ways. And then when you add on top of just that natural part, you've got the whole effect of what sin can do to distort that. That can end up shifting us in directions we don't want to go. So what we're not looking at today is good uses and bad uses. We're saying even when we're using it for good, there are these transformative effects that we sometimes don't always see. So we want to learn how to anticipate those by looking at the biblical story. But first, I just want to celebrate a couple of things. Here's just two little charts that show you over the last 200 years how wonderful technology has been for society. So the first graph is about 90% of people used to be in poverty. Now it's the other way around. Only 10% of people are in poverty worldwide. The same thing with literacy rates. It used to only be about 10% of people had literacy 200 years ago. Now that's 90%. These are amazingly transformative things that technology has done for society. The catch is that once we've been working for something and we get all the way to the end of it and we finally have a lot of what we've always wanted, we're not particularly good at processing that thing. So let me give you an example here. This idea of extreme poverty going down, well, what's happened in the US is that obesity is going up. So when we have an abundance of something we used to have to work for, we're not particularly good at handling it. So we were always looking for food. Now we have an abundance of food, and we're not that great at regulating that thing. And I think we're saying the same thing with information. We thought, man, if everybody was just literate, we would have this peaceful world where nobody had anxiety, nobody had any political fights, nobody worried about anything. And that's not necessarily what's happening right now. So what we're seeing is that overabundance is often something that we struggle with. And so what I'd argue is that with every new technological power comes an increased and even more difficult need for discipline. And I see this even in my own kids' lives. I could say in some ways their lives are easier, but in some ways their lives are a lot harder. The types of things they have to deal with and what they have to say no to is a lot different. So let's look at the biblical story and we'll try to see how we can find some of these things in the text. So I'm going to just walk us through. I've got kind of 5 little stages. So we're going to start with, and you'll see a little kind of icon for each of these, that creation, then we'll go to the fall, then we'll go to anticipation, looking forward, the law and the tablets. We'll go to salvation, and then we'll go to the end of redemption. So thank you for laughing at my icons. I really appreciate that. It makes me feel good. So in creation, we open up the Bible, and the very first thing we see, the first thing that the Bible tells us about God is that God is a creator, that God made things. And the next thing he says, he goes through and he creates these 3 rhythmic days and the other 3 rhythmic days, and there's separation in the first 3 and filling in the next 3. And then he gets to this point where he comes to the pinnacle of creation, and he creates male and female. It says, male and female are created in my image. And so we bear this image, and so we're going, okay, well, then what does that mean? What does it mean to bear God's image? Well, we get some clues as God tells us what we're supposed to be doing in Genesis 1, and then particularly in Genesis 2, when God looks at the garden and says there's no plants in the garden yet, and that's because it hasn't rained yet, but also because there isn't a person there yet in the garden to take care of it. So he puts the first human there and says, your job is to work it and to take care of it. And so those little words for work and take care of, one of those is the word from which we get culture or cultivate. And so it always has a tool using idea behind it, that when you're going to take care of something, that you're going to use a tool to do that. And yet we're also called to guard and preserve. So we are called to make things from what God's made, but also to restore some of that natural world of who we are and what God's creation is. So if we think about, what our calling is we're tasked with ordering the natural world. You've heard Tim Keller probably put it in a little bit better way here, but this way of ordering the natural world by using tools. And this is why I would say that fundamentally in a theological way, technology is good. So when God looks at what he's made and said, it is good, and looks at you and says, you are very good, then he gives you the task of making things. That means that our making is a good thing. So we want to claim that theologically. And yet, when we're taking care of a garden, there's a little bit of a subtle thing that happens. So if you have a shovel, and that's your tool, and you're using it to dig, you could use it for morally good ends, and you could use it for morally bad ends. So you could do things like build houses, or you could do things like axe murder people and bury them. The catch is, at the end of the day, what happens to your hands when you shovel all day? You get blisters and calluses. If you keep using it, your muscles get bigger. If you keep doing it, you have knowledge of the soil. So you get changed as you're using the tool. And notice, it doesn't matter if you're using it for morally good ends or morally bad ends. Either way, you get transformed when you use it. And this is true of physical tools, but it's also especially true of the more mental tools that we're using today. So if we begin to think about, so how does this affect the aspects of the image of God? So theologians kind of divide this up in a couple categories. The first one is just our substance. Like, people used to think, well, the one thing that separates us from animals is our minds. And so this part of us that has a soul, that becomes what the image of God is. Others would say, well, maybe it's more that job that God has given us, this functional thing where we are to stand there. And when Jesus takes that coin and he said, whose image is on this coin? That coin represented Caesar all through the land, that we are representative functional rulers for God. Or just our relationship with him. All 3 of those things are different aspects of the image of God. But in the age of AI, this begins to shift a little bit. And so in the age of science, we had some pushes on the image of God, and now we're seeing it with AI. So a couple things I would mention, and first off, I'm going to switch image of God. The Hebrew word for God, for Lord, is Adonai, so I'm going to call it Adonai's image. You might see what I did there. So when it comes to the substantive part, whenever we begin to use a tool, like I'm using a microphone right now, and it's extending part of me. But because I've grown up using microphones, I don't have the ability to project my voice. So it's extended, but also amputated. My GPS extends where I can go, but I also don't know how to get to my sister's house about 10 miles west of here. I am totally dependent on the tool. So what we're seeing is that technology is always extending and amputating, and AI is we're beginning to see how people's minds are being affected as we use it. On the functional side of things, it's interesting, AI will probably be more efficient at just about anything than we could do. So when it comes to taking care of the garden, your machine is probably going to come up with something better than you can, but that machine doesn't necessarily have the kind of wisdom to understand what human flourishing really is. And so we're going to always need that human in the loop to make sure that we're fully expressing the image of God. And then relationally, machines will never have the same relationship with God that we have, and yet we're starting to see more and more and more people, all the theology bots that we've all created, they immediately turn into therapy bots, right? People immediately go to them for their deeper issues. They don't want to just know about what forgiveness is in the abstract. They want to know if they need to be able to forgive their husband for cheating on them. And so we're seeing these really deep connections being formed there in this age of AI. And just one more thing, a study from Microsoft was recently showing that when they surveyed a bunch of workers, they were getting some neat productivity gains. At the same time, the more and more that they used that, they also saw that their critical thinking went down and the diversity of the results of what they produced went down. So there's some pros and cons in this in terms of our acceleration of what our output is, but a deceleration of who we are as people at the same time. So that's sort of the opening of creation, and then we move into the fall period. And there's this big promise that the servant makes. He says, you will not certainly die. And he says, you will be like God. And this seems to be the perpetual promise that we are always tempted toward, that we were made in God's likeness, and this is what gives us our human dignity, but we want God-likeness. We want to become like God, and we want our tools and our technology sometimes to do that for us. And so what we end up seeing is that there is this story that we tell about how the world works. This is kind of the gospel story of what we're looking forward to. But there is this alternative story that sometimes shows up that we don't really have any divine origin. We're just here by chance. And the big problem is our bodies. What we're hoping for is some technological savior, and maybe that's a singularity or an AI or something like that, that will then free us from our bodies. And so we want to be able to resist that alternative narrative and live through the biblical story rather than this alternative story that we sometimes see. So we move on, though, when Adam and Eve, the very first thing we see them do as sinful beings is to create something. So they realized they were naked and they sewed fig leaves. I don't know what they used to sew, but Adam and Eve's first action as fallen human beings was to make and to create. And when God comes and condemns and talks about what the consequences of sin are, he doesn't condemn their act of making. What does he do to their act of making? Yeah, he gives them their first free tech upgrade, right? He ends up coming alongside and making garments of skin. And we know, theologically, this is looking forward to Christ. So they couldn't cover their sin with their own works, that it was going to require something to die. But I also think this is God kind of shifting, in a sense, the purpose of technology, that it used to be this thing that was for caring for the garden and for moving on and saying, we're going to fill the earth with not just more people, but also with the things we've made. In this era of sin, I think there's a new thing where we are using technology in some way to overcome some of the temporary downsides of sin. So my wife would say, yes, the curse of childbirth, yes, get an epidural. That overcomes some of the effects of the fall. And we can use this to share the good news. The temptation, I think, for us is to believe that technology itself is the good news. And you often see a lot of our companies are almost presenting it that way sometimes. And so we want to say, embrace this good gift of God and not misconstrue it, though, as being the good news itself. So that's the creation and the fall. And then we move into the Old Testament where the law is given, and we start to see some little things about where the story is going to go. But notice the very first commandment is about who God is, that you're not to have any other gods before me. The second commandment right after that is about how we use media and technology to portray that. So have no other gods, but don't make for yourself certain kinds of images. So again, they could have made like a sanctioned Yahweh doll that they had to buy at Hebrew Mart or something like that. That could have been the way that God made it. But instead of doing that, he decided, we're going to say that I'm not like any other God. And to ensure that you have that, you're not going to make anything like any other God. God cannot be contained. He can't be bought. He can't be pushed over. And so we're not going to make an image of God. So this theme of image bearing and then image making becomes really important through the scriptures. And so what we see, too, throughout the Old Testament is there's this statement that there's these alluring idols, these things that are made by human hands, but they can't really see. They can't really think. They can maybe talk, but not really do anything. And the catch is, notice this verse here at the end of Psalms, it says, those who make them will become like them. And so there's this temptation for us to idolize the things that we make. Those are literal idols, but we do that with all kinds of things that we make. And so we begin to idolize a certain way of life and a certain level of wealth. And so the things that we make becomes the things that we idolize. And so what we have is this sort of what I would call a movement where we are saying that these temporary benefits that we get, all idols do is they give you something right away, but then they push you away from who you are as God's image and ultimately connection with him. And so I call this sort of reversing the image of God, where God made us to be his image bearers, and he made us to rule over all creation and to make things from what he's made. This is what we're called to do. But what we end up doing is we end up worshiping sometimes the things that we make. And then not only do we do that, so that's bad, worshiping the things we make, but then we begin to redefine who we are by the things that we make. So right now, we all kind of believe that we should be on 24/7. God showed us in his pattern of creation, 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. That doesn't work in an always-on world. And so we begin to think that we should function like machines, and ultimately then we begin to remake God in this image. And so we distort what it is to be the image of God. We are God's representative rulers, and yet we end up making the things that we make be our representative rulers that push us back up this way. And so this is something we need to watch out for, the more especially as we develop things that are kind of like our little image bearers in AI. We also see, sometimes when you think about things like AI, technology, you're going, the Bible doesn't really say anything about that. But I think it anticipates it in some really interesting ways. The most common thing that you see all throughout the Hebrew Bible in each of the different sections is this command about unjust scales. When I think about an individual tool like a sword, I can stab one person with a sword, but a scale I can shoot an entire village out of. And so I think the Bible is saying you need to take really seriously tools and technology that can be used at scale. And so we see this in every aspect of the Hebrew Bible, this repeated command to be careful about these things. And that's why I think I really appreciate all the partners and people who are here. They developed some great redemptive frameworks and some great ethical tools that you can look through and think through, kind of pull off the shelf, use at your own place. So I'm not going to go through those, but I think they're all worth looking at and thinking through really in a deep way. But there's also one little kind of tech ethic that's in the Old Testament that I really like, so I want to show you that one. It's just a really funny, obscure verse right there in Deuteronomy. And it says this: when you build a house, you shall make a parapet for the roof, so that you don't bring the guilt of blood upon your house if anyone should fall from it. This is just a fun little thing. If you look in your Bible, it's like under a heading that just says various commands. They're not really particularly organized, but I love this one because it really gets to this act of making. But notice that funny little word parapet there. Does anybody know what a parapet is? Yeah, it's that little part across the top, a little outline there that makes sure that you don't fall off the edge. So I don't have a parapet here, so I could fall off the edge. But if I needed a little border there, that would help me from falling off the edge. What I love about this command is that I think it kind of gives you a threefold way of thinking about our own ethical responsibility for making. So here's how it works. The first thing is just we should build. I notice it doesn't say if you build or if you have to build, guys. It says when you build. The assumption is we are builders. We are made in the image of God to make things from what he's made. So when you build, you're supposed to build. So build. But two, build things for human flourishing. So build houses. So none of you are in here to cheat people out of things or to make all kinds of like deep fake nasty stuff out there. I love what you're doing. You are building things for human flourishing. This is what we're called to do, to redirect all these resources that someone might have meant for bad, to move these into something for good. And yet, even if we are called to build things for human flourishing like houses, we're also called to think through some of the impacts that our building can make. And notice that parapet is really thinking through an accidental scenario. How could this maybe be used in a wrong way? So it's creating safety systems for us. I know a lot of you are working in these spaces with AI, trying to think through how do we build in safety systems? How do we not just prevent bad actors from doing bad things, but how do we prevent people from accidentally doing things and accidentally deleting data or accidentally sharing data? And so I appreciate so much of the work that so many of you are doing to do that. So thank you for that. So look at that little passage of Deuteronomy. I hope that can be a little guiding principle for you. So this morning, we had we'll talk about Jesus and technology. I want to add one thing to that, which is this. When we think about who Jesus was when he comes, he ends up being the one through whom all things were made. So Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, is this person who is also a maker, that the Father makes through the Son and by the Spirit. So he makes all things. He makes all of us. And in some way, we, the creation, turn on the Creator. But I also want to say that when he was on earth, he actually was a literal technologist. And we know this because the Greek word for carpenter is actually the word tektone. So we translate the word tektone, which literally means artisan or craftsperson, someone who makes something with his or her hands. We translate that carpenter because we think that the kind of artisan that Joseph and his son Jesus would have been is a carpenter, but we're not exactly sure. It's a good guess. What I think is fascinating about this is that Jesus is a second Adam in a way, that he is holy and righteous and fulfilled all the things that God wanted us to do. But he's also a second Adam in that he's fulfilling that call to make from what God has made. He's making things. Remember the time when he got people out of the temple who were selling all kinds of things? It said he actually made the whip. Can you imagine that if you were that mad and you needed to cool down a little bit, so you just took some time to make the whip before you went in? So Jesus actually makes a whip in that moment. But here, he's called Tektone. And what I think is so fascinating about this part of the story is this cross that we see up here is this symbol of human death, where we have taken God's creation of a tree and we've twisted it into death. But this is fascinating to me because we, the creation, turn on the Creator. And then Jesus, the human being, the technology with which he worked, wood and nails, is the technology on which he died. And I think what this tells us is that God deeply cares not only about redeeming our souls, but about resurrecting our bodies and about redeeming the things that we make. He cares about that so much that he bakes it here into the story. They nailed him to a cross, this physical thing that then he has converted into a symbol of hope and joy and peace for all of us. And then the New Testament plays a little bit too with some of the things that we are debating about today, about when do we do things in person and when do we do things online. So at the end of 2 John and 3 John, he says this. He says, I have a lot of things I wanted to write to y'all. That's from the y'all version. But I don't want to always use paper and ink. Instead, there are some things that I want to come to y'all and talk to y'all face to face about. And I don't think this is him saying face to face is always better. I think this is him saying, we need to have real wisdom and discernment to know which one is right. Because even in some of Paul's letters, he'll write to the Corinthians and he'll say, I wanted to come to you guys, but I was so mad that I thought it would be more redemptive to write a letter. And then I could come to you afterward. So sometimes a technologically mediated way can actually be really helpful, and other times being in person is helpful. And we need the wisdom of communities to know when that is. That may vary by culture, that may vary by age and generation, but this is the kind of thing that we need to do. But I also want to say this technologically mediated versus face-to-face, we're now in this area of chatbots, and some of the early data that we see about all these things is there is some helpfulness. We have a lot of data saying that people are very lonely, and this has been going on for well before we had phones and into the early 2000s with bowling alone and all those kinds of things. But you see some data saying there's maybe some initial lowering of depression and anxiety, but then you do see some of these kind of illicit and uncomfortable behaviors happening at the same time. And like we're seeing with most of our Bible chatbots is that people are turning to them in therapeutic ways. And we need to be very aware of that, is that we don't just need to build sort of theologically accurate things. We also need to be thinking about this therapeutic side and what's happening with that as well. So what I would say is this, I'm not spending a lot of time on kind of these deep existential questions. Does AI actually have empathy? But what I would say is I don't know that it really matters. Because I think what people are experiencing when they talk to AI feels so much more like empathy than what almost any American experiences on their day-to-day basis, that it really doesn't matter. Because most people don't have anybody in their life who can listen to them for 30 minutes with a sort of non-judgmental, caring attitude that really listens, isn't just immediately trying to say something or check their phone. So I think one of the most countercultural skills that you can develop just as a human being in the 21st century is the ability to listen to a person, to really actually listen, because AIs are way better at it than almost any of us are. They're constantly patient, they always listen, they're always there, and most of us can't do that for people in our lives. So if we can do that, I think that we can bring more of Jesus, more of Emmanuel to more people than almost any tool that we would have. So AI, I don't know if it'll ever be fully empathetic, but it sure feels like it. And I think this is why the New Testament is going to tell us these things like, let's not give up this habit of meeting together. And I love that so many ministries here are spending time developing products and saying, how do we reach people with our tools? How do we use AI and all these things, but then call them into local communities? And I so appreciate the intentional effort that so many of you are doing in that space. But I do want to sort of project into the future a little bit, because I do think that there are some things we're going to see coming up. I see things this way, is that what's happened over the last 20 or 30 years is there are base underlying technologies that technologists like us are really interested in, companies and businesses are interested in, and then later on, a decade or so later, we get a sort of physically embodied version of that then begins to change society. So I would say it this way, is somewhere, the internet's been around in the 80s and early 90s, but it becomes public in the mid-90s, and you start to see this big wave of the dot-com bubble and all that stuff is happening. Early companies, some are rising, some are falling. Then it takes about a decade for the embodied tool to bring the internet to everybody. And what was that embodied tool? What's the thing that's in everybody's pocket, the glowing rectangle, right? It's a phone. So once the internet was in terminals, remember when you watched movies like The Matrix and you pulled phones and stuff like that? That was that early era. And now we have this physical thing in us that brings all of that together and brings it to us and really shapes our life and becomes a kind of image bearing. I mean, I'm usually more afraid to lose my phone than I am to lose my keys or even my wallet. I'm so attached to it. Like, watch this. This is really painful. it hurts. Every step hurts me to walk away from this thing because it's so attached to who I am and my own identity. Now I think we're in this age of AI, and so it's this fundamental technology that we're all building, but what's the physical manifestation of AI? What will that be? For now, it can still be our phones, but I do think we're going to move to this era of some type of embodied robotics something. I don't know exactly what it'll look like, so I didn't try to make it be, too humanoid or something like that, but I do think we're moving in the next decade or so to this era of some type of physically embodied thing. And we're seeing a lot of things where someone has a kind of an Alexa-type device, say, in a nursing home for an elderly person, and it gives them someone to talk to. But if that gets pulled away, I mean, that's their whole life because no one comes and visits that person. And so especially if it becomes less of like a smart speaker and more looks like an animal or something that has some type of anthropomorphic features, people's attachment is even deeper to that thing. So if you can imagine not just ordering, more food or more clothes, but actually sharing your deepest, most intimate thoughts, when that thing is physically embodied and not just in a chatbot, that connection gets even deeper and deeper and deeper. And so people are formed in the way of having relationships with machines that are always listening to them, always amenable to them, always wanting to please them. And that's not exactly how human relationships always work out. So again, even if someone's not using it for bad, they're being formed in a particular way in the way that they think. So we have some things that are going to be happening in the next couple of years that we need to be watching out for. The good news is that the biblical story, I grew up in that tradition where, you pray a prayer and you go up to heaven, and that was the big hope, to go up there. And I always secretly thought it sounded really terrible and pretty boring. I did not want to go to heaven. I just thought it sounded not as much fun because there was no Nintendos and stuff like that there. But what I found out when you actually read the end of the story is that it ends this way. It says a new heavens and a new earth, and there's a holy city that comes out of heaven down to earth, full of all the things that humans make, roads and trumpets and banners. And I don't know if there's screens, or I don't know exactly what all is there. I'm not going to go all Dallas Seminary and end times on you. But I do think it is a physical end times world where God has redeemed our souls, resurrected our bodies, and even redeemed the things that we have made. And so I think right now, our responsibility is going, how can we make things in light of that day? How can we live in light of that day in a moral sense, but also how can we make things today that could be used in that era? Because when we look at, all these promises, they don't say God's going to destroy all the things that we make. Instead, he's going to convert these things that we meant for evil into things that can be used for human flourishing. And so there's this hope that all of creation is waiting for this to be liberated from the bondage of sin. So the things that you're making now may be things that there's some version of this in the future that we can honor and glorify our God with. And so again, this is this moment where we have this incredible technological power. We should reclaim this as a good thing from God. But we need to think about how we're going to discipline. So what I want to show you kind of as our kind of landing the plane thing is, as we're thinking about developing competencies and skills in ourselves and in the people that we're responsible for in the next generation. So I've got teenage kids and I'm thinking about what type of skills do they need? There's a competency framework that would say you start out unaware of what you know, unconsciously incompetent, and then you get to become conscious of your incompetence. So that's kind of the first layer. Then you develop some skills that you can do, and then you eventually develop it where that skill is unconscious. You're just good at that skill. So these are just a couple of different ways that people think about how you develop skill over time. Now, when I think about introducing a technological aid, especially AI, into that, I do think we need to be thinking really carefully about when do we introduce that tool. So, for example, I think at the very beginning, if you were to introduce it very, very, very early, you could block that person's entire development, right? This is the reason why we don't give calculators to kindergartners, because we want them to understand some of the basics of math. Then there's a place where I think that it becomes a kind of a replacement. It speeds up, and you're able to say, this thing that I learned a little bit of that took me 5 hours, now it really does speed that up. The worry and concern that I think we should have is, does that block that person's ability to go any further? So it's not as bad as just too early on, but it may block that person. Now, on the flip side, we don't give calculators to kindergartners, right? But if we don't give calculators to high school students, we're also not really serving them well. So at a certain point of knowledge, I think this technology and skill really does speed you up. And not using it ends up becoming a kind of risk. So if we don't use, say, AI in the process of translation to speed these up, I think that's really on our head. So those of you who are doing that, man, kudos to you. And at the same time, that's built on a lot of human knowledge. It's not happening at the very bottom. It's happening somewhere in the middle. And I think that person that's an expert becomes this kind of accent for it. So I'll leave that on there for a minute. I'm happy to send it. I think there is some type of sweet spot in here, and we just need to be thinking carefully about this as we think about our own lives and our own work coworkers, what skills do we want to retain as part of our image bearing of who God is? And what things do we want to change and what things do we want to do something else with and say, hey, it's okay for me to not know how to get to my sister's house. That's okay for me to do because I want to be able to do something else. And when do I say, no, I want to know what reality is and I want to be able to know how to get there. So these are the kind of questions that we're doing. And here's the way I would phrase it. It is really important for us to ask these questions. What has God called me to produce? What has he called me to make? But I think for us as individuals, a question that may be even more important is who do we want to become? So the way I would put this is something like this. Do you want to become the kind of person that can look up the length of a marathon or a person that can run it? Because those are really two different things. Access to information and actually internalized ability are two different things. And when it comes to Scripture, do you want to have just exposure to Scripture or do you want to have it saturate you and change who you are? Because what the Bible asks you to do is not have access to it, but to meditate on it and to do it. And to have those, that requires something internal that a machine can't do for us. So Melvin, since I've got a minute, would you jump me to that Hebrew slide? Next one right there. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Okay, so I want to do one last Hebrew lesson, one last encouragement, okay? This is going to do a little quick translation of Hebrew. Can anybody read this? Okay, here we go. We'll do AI translation. Here we go. Said Yahweh, so Yahweh said to Joshua, don't fear or be dismayed. Take with you the army, all the people, arise and go attack the city of Ai. So what I want to encourage you guys is rise up. Don't fear, don't be dismayed, but rise up and go attack it. Go out there and attack AI. So here's my final 5 things that I want to give you just for the end. Here, let me skip this one. Here's my final 5 things that I want to give you. Reclaim technology is a good. It is not neutral. It is not bad. It is a good gift from God. Reclaim that, but avoid making it be a savior. At the same time, for you as individuals, you may want to learn skills first and then accelerate with technology and help those people around you to do that so you don't limit them. And I would say this, experiment widely, though, at the same time. This is not a fear technology. Experiment, but do it in some type of community. And then I would say, too, you guys are the best educators of your pastors. They don't know what's going on, and they require you. And so lastly, I would say this, to avoid the alluring idols and to continue to express Adonai's image. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.